My name is Donovan Hartwell, and I was head librarian at Phoenix's Maryvale Public Library when the zombie outbreak began. In 72 hours, I watched my quiet neighborhood turn into a hunting ground where the infected coordinated attacks. Like military units, I had to choose between saving people and preserving the knowledge that might save humanity's future. This is how a librarian became a survivor. Before we start the video, let us know what country you are tuning in from in the comment section below. Perhaps we will make a story there. Let's begin. My name is Donovan Hartwell, and 3 days ago I was just another head librarian at the Maryvale Public Library in Phoenix, Arizona. I had been working there for 12 years, building what I thought was one of the most comprehensive survival and technical knowledge collections in the region. Military manuals donated by retiring veterans, medical references from doctors cleaning out their offices, agricultural texts from farmers, engineering blueprints from construction companies. I used to joke with my colleagues that I was preparing for something I never thought would actually happen. I was wrong about that last part. You see, being a librarian taught me that information saves lives. Whether it was helping someone find job application requirements, researching medical conditions, or locating emergency contact numbers, I learned that the right information at the right time could change everything. What I never expected was how literal that would become when the world started falling apart. I am mixed heritage, Irish American, and Cherokee, and my grandmother used to tell me stories about sicknesses that change people. Old tribal stories that I always assumed were just folklore about some historical epidemic. She would describe how people would become something else entirely, how they would hunt in groups, how the sickness would spread through water sources. I kept those stories in the back of my mind the same way I kept my grandfather's old military survival manual in my desk drawer. Sentimental value, nothing more, or so I thought. Tuesday morning started like any other. I arrived at the library around 7:30, unlocked the building, and began my usual routine. The Maryvale branch serves a predominantly Latino neighborhood, and we had built strong relationships with the community over the years. Families knew me by name, kids would come to me for help with homework, and the seniors had their weekly programs that they never missed. Mrs. Rodriguez was one of those seniors. Every Tuesday at 10 in the morning, she would arrive for the computer class I ran. She had been coming for 3 years straight, never missing a single session. She was learning to video chat with her grandchildren in Mexico, and she was so proud of her progress. When 10 o'clock came and went without her, I started to worry. The phones had been ringing constantly since I opened that morning. Normally we might get a dozen calls before noon, but this was different. People were calling asking if we were still open, which was strange because we had never closed unexpectedly. Others were asking specifically for medical books, wanting to know if we had information about infections or diseases. One woman called asking if we had any books about water quality testing because something was wrong with her neighborhood's water supply. I had recently finished cataloging a new collection of CDC outbreak protocols that had been donated by a retiring public health official. As I fielded these calls, I found myself thinking about those protocols more than I should have been. There was something in the urgency of these voices that made me uncomfortable. Around 11 in the morning, I noticed that the usual flow of patrons had slowed to almost nothing. The library was eerily quiet. Even the children's section, which was normally bustling with storytime activities, felt empty. The few people who did come in seemed nervous, constantly looking over their shoulders, asking questions about security procedures and emergency exits. I was reorganizing the medical reference section when Mr. Vasquez called about his son Tommy. Tommy was 15, a good kid who had been coming to the library since he was 8 years old. He used to check out every Captain Underpants book we had, and over the years I had watched him grow into a responsible teenager who sometimes helped me stack returned books, Mr. Vasquez was speaking Spanish very quickly, and my understanding was limited, but I caught enough to know that Tommy was in trouble at home. Something about his mother acting strange, about needing a safe place to stay. I told him to bring Tommy to the library, that we would figure something out. While I waited for them to arrive, I decided to check on Mrs. Rodriguez. Her house was only a few blocks away, and she had given me her number for emergencies. When I called, the phone rang and rang with no answer. I tried asterisk twice more throughout the morning, but still nothing. The first real sign that something was seriously wrong came when I was eating lunch in the staff room. I had made myself a sandwich and was reviewing some new acquisitions when I heard someone pounding on the front doors. Not knocking, pounding. Desperate, frantic pounding that echoed through the entire building. I rushed to the front desk and saw Tommy Vasquez standing outside the glass entrance doors. His face was white as paper, and he was looking back over his shoulder like something was chasing him. When I unlocked the doors to let him in, I immediately noticed the scratches on his arms. They were deep, fresh, and looked like they had been made by fingernails. Tommy was breathing hard and could barely speak. When he finally managed to get words out, what he said changed everything. "Mr. Hartwell, you have to lock the doors. Something is wrong with people. My mom, she tried to bite my little sister. She was acting like an animal." I stared at him, trying to process what he was saying. Tommy had never lied to me, never exaggerated stories for attention. He was one of the most level-headed teenagers I knew. But what he was describing sounded impossible. "Tommy, slow down. Tell me exactly what happened." He rolled up his sleeves to show me the scratches more clearly. "My mom has been acting weird for 2 days. She stopped talking to us, stopped eating, just sat in her room staring at the wall. This morning she came out, and she looked different. Her eyes were all cloudy and white. When my little sister tried to hug her, Mom grabbed her and tried to bite her neck. I had to pull her off." I felt something cold settle in my stomach. The scratches on Tommy's arms were real. The fear in his eyes was real. And suddenly all those phone calls asking about medical books and water quality started making sense in a way I did not want them to. I helped Tommy clean his wounds using the first aid kit we kept behind the circulation desk. As I worked, I found myself thinking about those CDC protocols I had been cataloging. There had been sections about quarantine, procedures, about identifying biological threats, about community response to epidemic outbreaks. Information that had seemed academic and theoretical was suddenly feeling very practical and immediate. "Tommy, I need you to think carefully. Has your mom been drinking tap water? Has anyone else in your neighborhood been acting strange?" He nodded slowly. "Yeah, she drinks a lot of water. And yeah, Mr. Chun from down the street has been walking around his yard all night for the past 3 days. Just walking in circles, not responding when people call to him." Mr. Chun was the mail carrier for our neighborhood. I had known him for years, always friendly and reliable. The idea of him walking in circles all night was disturbing in ways I could not quite articulate. I was about to ask Tommy more questions when I heard screaming from the parking lot. Not the kind of screaming you hear when someone is startled or angry. This was pure terror, the sound of someone fighting for their life. Through the tall windows that faced the parking lot, I could see Mr. Chun stumbling across the asphalt. But he was not walking right. His left leg was dragging behind him, and there were dark stains covering his postal worker uniform. His movements were jerky and unnatural, like a marionette being controlled by someone who did not know how to use the strings properly. Behind him, 3 more people were following with that same strange, unnatural gait. I recognized them too. Mrs. Martinez, who always checked out romance novels, Jason the teenager who had helped me move furniture last month, and Mrs. Williams who worked as a crossing guard at the elementary school down the block. But they were not trying to help Mr. Chun. They were not walking together as friends or neighbors. There was something predatory in the way they moved, something coordinated and purposeful that made my skin crawl. When Mr. Chun collapsed near the bike racks, they fell on him. The sounds that came next were wet and terrible, sounds that I had never heard before, but somehow knew were the sounds of flesh being torn. Tommy grabbed my arm so hard that I knew I would have bruises later. "Lock the doors," I whispered, finally, understanding what we were dealing with. But even as I moved toward the entrance, I could see more of them gathering in the street. Their clothes were torn and bloody, their skin had a grayish pallor, and their eyes were the same cloudy white that Tommy had described in his mother. Some of them I recognized from the neighborhood, others were strangers, but they all moved with that same jerky, unnatural coordination. They were not random. They were not confused or sick in any normal sense. They were hunting, and they were doing it together. I locked the front doors and activated the security system, something I had never had to do during operating hours. The library suddenly felt different, transformed from a place of learning and community into something that might need to be defended. Tommy was staring out the windows with wide eyes. "They are looking at us," he said quietly. He was right. The infected, and I was already starting to think of them as infected rather than sick, were turning their attention to the library building. Some of them were pressing their faces against the glass, leaving smears of blood and something else I did not want to identify. I needed to think systematically, the way I approached any complex research problem. What did I know? What resources did I have? What information could help us survive whatever this was? First, I knew the building better than anyone. 12 years of working here meant I understood every entrance, every emergency exit, every structural detail. I knew where the supplies were kept, where the emergency equipment was stored, and how the building systems worked. Second, I had access to more survival and emergency information than almost anywhere else in the city. Those medical texts, military manuals, engineering guides, and agricultural references were not just books anymore. They were potentially life-saving resources. Third, I had Tommy, who despite being young and scared, was smart and brave enough to have escaped from his infected mother and made it to safety. What I did not know was how many more people might be coming to the library seeking shelter, how long this situation might last, or what exactly we were dealing with in terms of the infection itself. The phones had stopped ringing, which was somehow more ominous than when they had been ringing constantly. I tried calling 911, but the line was busy. I tried calling the police department directly, but got no answer. I tried calling the mayor's office, the county health department, and the emergency management office. Nothing. Tommy was still watching the infected outside. "There are more of them now," he said. "And they are not just wandering around anymore. They are looking at the building like they are studying it." I joined him at the window and felt my stomach drop. He was right. What had started as maybe 6 or 7 infected individuals had grown to at least 20, and they were not behaving randomly. Some of them were walking around the perimeter of the building. Others were testing the doors and windows, and a few were just standing and staring at us with those cloudy white eyes. It was then that Mrs. Patterson arrived. She was 83 years old, a retired nurse who came to the library twice a week to read medical journals and help with our health information programs. She had worked at Phoenix General Hospital for 40 years before retiring, and her medical knowledge was encyclopedic. When I saw her approaching the building, I realized that I had to let her in, despite the danger. I unlocked the doors just long enough for her to slip inside, then secured them again immediately. She was out of breath and shaking, but otherwise seemed unharmed. "Donovan, thank goodness you are here. The hospital is chaos. Something is wrong with people, some kind of infection. The emergency room is overrun, and the staff is starting to get sick too." Her words confirmed what I was beginning to suspect. This was not isolated to our neighborhood. This was bigger, much bigger. "Mrs. Patterson, are you hurt? Are you feeling all right?" She shook her head. "I am fine, but I need to tell you what I saw at the hospital. People are being brought in with bite wounds and scratches, and within hours they are becoming violent and incoherent. The doctors are calling it some kind of rapid onset neurological infection, but they have no idea how to treat it." Tommy looked up from the window. "My mom had the same thing. She was fine 3 days ago, then she started acting weird, and this morning she was trying to bite my sister." Mrs. Patterson's face went pale. "How long ago did this happen, Tommy?" "About 4 hours ago. I ran here as fast as I could." She turned to me with a look of professional concern. "Donovan, if this infection spreads as quickly as what I saw at the hospital, we need to prepare for more people to be affected. And we need to prepare for the possibility that normal emergency services might not be available." As if to emphasize her point, we heard the sound of breaking glass from somewhere else in the building. One of the infected had found a way to break a window on the north side of the library. I grabbed the radio from the security office and tried to reach the other library branches, but got only static. I tried the emergency services frequency, but heard only fragmented broadcasts talking about widespread incidents and avoid contact with affected individuals. It was then that Miguel Santos arrived. He was a construction worker who often used our computers to look for jobs and sometimes helped us with maintenance issues. He was carrying a tool belt and looked like he had been in a fight. When he pounded on the doors, I could see that his hard hat was cracked and his work clothes were torn. I let him in quickly, and he immediately began assessing our situation like the experienced contractor he was. "The whole city is going crazy," he said without preamble. "I was working on a job site downtown when people started attacking each other. Not fighting, attacking, like animals. I grabbed my tools and tried to get to my truck, but they were everywhere." He looked around the library with professional eyes. "This building is solid, but those windows are going to be a problem. And if more of those things show up, we are going to need better defenses." Mrs. Patterson was checking Tommy's wounds more carefully. "These scratches are showing signs of infection," she said quietly. "The edges are red and there is some swelling. It might be related to whatever is causing this outbreak." I felt that cold feeling in my stomach again. Tommy had been exposed to whatever was causing this, and we had no idea what that might mean for him or for us. The radio crackled to life with a partial transmission. "All units, we have reports of coordinated attacks on Phoenix General Hospital, the University of Arizona Medical Campus, and multiple public safety facilities. Repeat, attacks appear to be coordinated. Avoid the downtown area and seek defensible positions." The transmission cut off, but the message was clear. This was not random chaos. Someone or something was directing these attacks, and they were targeting specific locations. I looked at my small group of survivors. Tommy, 15 years old and possibly infected. Mrs. Patterson, 83 years old but with invaluable medical knowledge. Miguel, strong and practical but as confused as the rest of us about what was happening. Outside, the infected were no longer just wandering around. They were testing the building systematically, looking for weaknesses, working together in ways that suggested they retained some form of intelligence. I made a decision that would define everything that came next. I walked to my desk and pulled out my grandfather's military survival manual. The leather cover was worn and the pages were yellowed, but the information inside had been tested in real combat situations. "Everyone, we need to start thinking of this as a siege situation. We have supplies, we have knowledge, and we have a defensible position. But we also have infected individuals who seem to be getting smarter about how they approach us." Mrs. Patterson nodded grimly. "At the hospital, I noticed that the infected patients were communicating with each other somehow. Not talking, but they seemed to coordinate their movements. Miguel was already examining the windows and doors. These windows are just standard glass. If they really want to get in, they will find a way. But I can reinforce the doors and maybe board up some of the windows if we have materials. I began pulling books from the survival section, looking for anything that might help us understand siege tactics, infection control, or emergency shelter procedures. As I worked, I found myself thinking about those Cherokee stories my grandmother used to tell. She had described sicknesses that changed people, that made them hunt in groups, that spread through water sources. At the time, I had assumed she was talking about historical epidemics like smallpox or cholera. But what if she was talking about something else entirely? What if these were not just stories but warnings passed down through generations? The sun was starting to set, and the infected outside were becoming more active. I counted at least 30 of them now, and they were definitely communicating with each other through some kind of gesture or sound system that we could not hear clearly. Tommy was getting worse. The scratches on his arms were more swollen, and he was developing a fever. Mrs. Patterson was monitoring him closely, but without proper medical equipment, there was not much she could do. "We need to move to a more defensible position," I announced. "The rare books vault in the basement has reinforced walls and a separate ventilation system. It was designed to protect valuable documents from fire and flood, but it might also protect us from whatever is happening up here." Miguel nodded approvingly. "Good thinking. Basements are naturally more defensible, and if this vault was built to special standards, it might buy us time to figure out our next move." As we began gathering supplies and essential books, I found myself thinking about the city planning documents I had been studying as part of a local history project. Phoenix had an extensive underground infrastructure, including abandoned subway construction and maintenance tunnels. Information that had seemed academic was suddenly becoming strategically important. We loaded a library cart with medical supplies, food from the staff room, water bottles, and what I considered the most essential survival manuals. I also grabbed the radio and a box of emergency supplies that had been stored in the security office. Mrs. Patterson was helping Tommy walk, but his condition was clearly deteriorating. The fever was getting worse, and he was starting to become disoriented. "Donovan," she said quietly, "I need to prepare you for the possibility that Tommy might not make it through the night. And if this infection is what I think it is, we need to be ready for what happens if he turns into one of those things." The weight of that statement hit me like a physical blow. Tommy was just a kid, a good kid who had trusted me enough to come to the library for safety. The idea that we might have to defend ourselves against him was almost too much to process. But I was learning that survival sometimes requires you to accept impossible realities and make plans based on them anyway. As we made our way down to the basement vault, I could hear the infected testing the windows more aggressively. The sound of glass creaking under pressure echoed through the building. We had survived the first day, but the real test was just beginning. The rare books vault turned out to be our salvation that first night. Built in the 1980s when the library was renovated, it was designed to protect Phoenix's most valuable historical documents from fire, flood, and theft. The walls were reinforced concrete, the door was steel with multiple locking mechanisms, and it had its own air filtration system. What the architects never imagined was that it would serve as a fortress against infected humans. Miguel had done an excellent job reinforcing our position. Using his construction expertise and tools from his belt, he had barricaded the main entrance to the basement and created early warning systems using library materials. Empty metal book carts positioned strategically would make noise if anyone tried to move them, and he had rigged the overhead lights to flicker if certain doors were opened upstairs. Mrs. Patterson had set up a makeshift medical station in one corner of the vault, using first aid supplies from the library and her decades of nursing experience. She had Tommy lying on a bed made from couch cushions taken from the staff lounge, and she was monitoring his condition with the systematic precision of someone who had seen everything during her 40 years at Phoenix General Hospital. Tommy's fever had spiked during the night, and the infection in his scratches was spreading faster than any of us had expected. Mrs. Patterson had cleaned the wounds and applied antibiotic ointment from our emergency supplies, but we all knew it was not enough. His skin was taking on that same grayish pallor we had seen in the infected outside, and his eyes were beginning to cloud over. But what worried me most was that Tommy was still conscious, still himself, even as his body was changing. He was fighting the infection with everything he had, and that gave me hope that maybe we could find a way to help him. Dawn came with the sound of breaking glass from upstairs. The infected had finally managed to breach the main floor, and we could hear them moving through the building above us. Their footsteps were not random wandering. They were systematic, methodical, like they were searching for something specific. "They know we are down here," Miguel whispered, listening to the sounds above us. "They are checking every room, every closet. That is not the behavior of mindless creatures." Mrs. Patterson looked up from checking Tommy's pulse. At the hospital, I noticed that the infected patients seemed to retain some problem-solving abilities. They could open doors, use simple tools, and they definitely communicated with each other. Whatever this infection is, it does not completely destroy cognitive function. I had been thinking about this too, and it connected to something my grandmother had told me years ago. In her stories about the changing sickness, she always emphasized that the affected people were not just mindless monsters. They were something else, something that retained enough human intelligence to be truly dangerous. The radio had been crackling with fragmentary transmissions throughout the night. Most of them were too garbled to understand, but we had caught enough to know that the situation was getting worse throughout Phoenix. Emergency services were overwhelmed, hospitals were being evacuated, and there were reports of coordinated attacks on government buildings and communication centers. What struck me as particularly ominous was that the attacks seemed to be targeting places where information was stored or transmitted. Libraries, universities, hospitals, government offices, radio stations. It was as if someone or something was systematically trying to destroy humanity's knowledge infrastructure. I shared this observation with the group, and Mrs. Patterson nodded grimly. That would explain why they are so focused on this building. Libraries are repositories of human knowledge, and if something is trying to cripple our ability to organize and respond, taking out information centers would be a logical strategy. Miguel was examining the building blueprints I had retrieved from my office before we moved to the vault. If they are really that smart, they will figure out the building layout eventually. These basement access points are not exactly hidden, and construction workers use these tunnels for maintenance all the time. That was when I remembered the city planning documents I had been studying. Phoenix had an extensive underground infrastructure that most people knew nothing about. Maintenance tunnels, abandoned subway construction from the 1990s, utility corridors that connected buildings throughout the downtown area. Information that could be crucial if we needed to escape without going back to the surface. "I have been working on a local history project about Phoenix's underground development," I told them. "There are maintenance tunnels that connect to this building, and some of them link up with the old subway construction that was never completed. If we can access those tunnels, we might be able to move around the city without encountering the infected on the surface." Mrs. Patterson was interested, but her primary concern was still Tommy. "Before we make any plans about moving, we need to address the elephant in the room. Tommy's condition is deteriorating rapidly, and based on what I observed at the hospital, he probably has less than 12 hours before the infection takes complete control." Tommy was awake and had heard everything we were saying. Despite his fever and the obvious pain he was in, he was still the same brave kid who had risked everything to warn us about his mother. "I do not want to hurt anyone," he said quietly. "If I start to change, if I become like those things outside, you have to stop me. Promise me that." The weight of that request settled over our small group like a physical presence. None of us wanted to think about what stopping Tommy might involve, but we all understood the necessity of it. I pulled out my grandfather's military manual and found the section on combat decision-making under extreme circumstances. The manual was blunt about the psychological challenges of making life or death choices, especially when they involved people you cared about. Tommy, we are not giving up on you yet. Mrs. Patterson knows more about medicine than anyone I have ever met, and we have access to medical references that might help us understand this infection better. But I also promise you that we will not let you become something that would hurt innocent people. Mrs. Patterson had been reading through the medical texts we had brought to the vault, cross-referencing symptoms and trying to understand the progression of the infection. The good news is that Tommy's infection seems to be progressing more slowly than what I observed at the hospital. That might be because he is young and healthy, or it might be because he was exposed to a smaller amount of whatever causes this condition. The bad news, which she did not say out loud but we all understood, was that slower progression just meant we had more time to watch him suffer. The sounds from upstairs had changed. Instead of random searching, we could hear coordinated movement, like the infected were working together to systematically explore every part of the building. Miguel's early warning systems were triggering regularly, indicating that they were testing our defenses and looking for ways to reach the basement. It was around noon when we heard the first attempts to break down the basement door. The infected had found the stairwell, and they were applying organized pressure to Miguel's barricades. The sound of splintering wood echoed through the basement as they worked to break through our defenses. "Time to go," Miguel announced, gathering his tools. "Those barricades will hold for maybe 30 minutes, but not much longer." I had been studying the building blueprints and the city planning documents, trying to identify the best route into the underground tunnel system. There was a maintenance access panel in the vault itself that connected to the building's utility corridors, and from there we could reach the larger tunnel network. Mrs. Patterson was preparing Tommy for transport, but his condition had worsened significantly. He was barely conscious, his breathing was labored, and the infection had spread up his arms and was beginning to affect his neck and face. "I do not think he can make the journey," she said quietly. "Moving him now might accelerate the infection process, and if he turns while we are in those tunnels, we could all be trapped." Tommy heard her and struggled to sit up. "Leave me here. I can delay them, maybe give you more time to escape." The idea of leaving Tommy behind was unthinkable, but I was beginning to understand that survival sometimes requires impossible choices. My grandfather's manual had an entire chapter about triage decisions, about having to prioritize mission success over individual lives, but Mrs. Patterson surprised us all. "I am staying with him. Someone needs to monitor his condition, and if the worst happens, someone needs to make sure he does not suffer." Miguel and I started to protest, but she held up her hand. "I am 83 years old. I have had a good life, and I have seen enough death to know how to handle what might be necessary. You two are young enough to have a chance at rebuilding. Whatever comes after this, take the medical knowledge, take the survival information, and use it to help other people." The sound of splintering wood was getting louder. Miguel's barricades were beginning to fail, and we could hear multiple infected working together to break through. Mrs. Patterson pressed a notebook into my hands. "I have been documenting everything I observed about the infection progression, symptoms, and potential treatments. This information might be crucial for developing countermeasures or helping other survivors." She also gave me a small bottle of pills from her purse. "These are antibiotics I keep for emergencies. They probably will not stop this infection, but they might slow its progression in someone who has been recently exposed." I realized she was thinking about Miguel and me, about the possibility that we had been exposed through close contact with Tommy or contaminated air in the building. We gathered our essential supplies quickly. I packed the most important survival manuals, the city planning documents, emergency supplies, and Mrs. Patterson's medical notes. Miguel took his tools and some building materials that might be useful for creating shelters or defenses in the tunnels. The maintenance access panel opened into a narrow utility corridor that ran beneath the library. The space was cramped and dark, but it was clearly part of a larger underground network. According to the city planning documents, these corridors connected to the abandoned subway construction about half a mile to the east. Mrs. Patterson hugged us both goodbye. Remember, information is the most valuable resource now. Preserve what you can, share what you must, and never stop learning. The people who survive this will be the ones who can adapt and apply knowledge to new situations. Tommy was unconscious now, but his breathing was more regular. Mrs. Patterson thought the infection might be entering a new phase, possibly one that would determine whether he lived or died. As Miguel and I prepared to enter the utility corridor, we heard the basement door finally give way. The infected had broken through, and they were pouring down the stairs. But instead of random chaos, we could hear organized movement, like they were conducting a tactical sweep of the basement. The last thing Mrs. Patterson said to us was something that would stay with me for the rest of this ordeal. If Tommy turns, I will make sure it is quick and painless. But if he fights off the infection, if he survives this, then maybe there is hope for developing treatments for other people. Either way, his struggle will not be meaningless. We sealed the maintenance access panel behind us and began crawling through the utility corridor toward the abandoned subway tunnels. The space was claustrophobic and filled with pipes and electrical conduits, but it was also our lifeline to potential safety. Behind us, we could hear the infected breaking into the rare books vault. There were no screams, no sounds of violence. Just the quiet voices of Mrs. Patterson talking to Tommy and the systematic, searching sounds of the infected exploring their new territory. Miguel and I crawled through that narrow corridor for what felt like hours. The city planning documents showed that the utility tunnels connected to a larger maintenance network, but actually navigating them in the dark was much more challenging than I had expected. We found the connection to the abandoned subway construction around 3 o'clock in the afternoon. The tunnel was much larger than the utility corridor, with enough space to stand upright and move more freely. According to the documents, this tunnel system had been intended to connect downtown Phoenix with the airport and several suburban areas, but funding had been cut before construction was completed. What we found in those tunnels changed everything I thought I knew about the scope of this crisis. We were not alone down there. Other survivors had the same idea about using underground spaces for safety, and we encountered our first group about an hour after entering the subway tunnel. They were huddled around a small camping stove, sharing canned food and speaking in hushed voices. A family of 4, parents and 2 teenage children, who had escaped from their home in central Phoenix when their neighborhood was overrun. The father, whose name was David, told us that they had been moving through the tunnels for 2 days, trying to reach the airport where they had heard rumors of military evacuation flights. What he told us about the surface situation was more disturbing than anything we had experienced at the library. The infected are not just attacking randomly, he explained. They are taking over territory, establishing control of neighborhoods and buildings, and they are using human survivors as some kind of workforce or resource. People who do not get infected are being captured and taken to central collection points. His wife, Sarah, had been a nurse at a different hospital than Mrs. Patterson, and she had similar observations about the infection's effects. The people who turned completely seemed to lose individual identity, but they gained some kind of collective intelligence. They work together like they are part of a hive mind or something. Their teenage son had been studying computer science before the outbreak, and he had an interesting theory about the coordinated attacks on information centers. What if this is not just random targeting? What if something is specifically trying to destroy human knowledge and communication systems? Like What if this is some kind of warfare designed to cripple our ability to organize and respond? The idea that this might be intentional, that someone or something was deliberately orchestrating the collapse of human civilization, was terrifying in ways I had not considered before. We shared our food and information with David's family, and they told us about other survivor groups they had encountered in the tunnel system. Apparently, there were dozens of people using the underground network to move around Phoenix without exposing themselves to the infected on the surface. But they also warned us about problems in the tunnels. Some sections were flooded due to broken water mains. Others had structural damage that made them dangerous to navigate, and a few areas had been found by the infected, who were apparently learning to track survivors underground. Miguel was particularly interested in the structural problems, since his construction background might help us navigate safely through damaged areas. He also pointed out that if the infected were learning to use the tunnels, we needed to be much more careful about security and movement. As we prepared to continue toward the airport, David's family shared one more piece of crucial information. They had encountered other survivors who claimed to have radio contact with military units outside Phoenix, and the news was not good. Similar outbreaks were occurring in cities across the country, all following the same pattern of coordinated attacks on information and communication infrastructure. Las Vegas, Tucson, Albuquerque, and several cities in California were reporting identical situations, suggesting that this was a coordinated national or even international crisis. The military was apparently struggling to maintain communication, with affected areas, and evacuation efforts were being hampered by the systematic destruction of airports, radio stations, and government facilities. What made this information particularly disturbing was the timeline. If multiple cities were experiencing coordinated attacks simultaneously, then this was not a natural epidemic or accidental outbreak. This was warfare, conducted by an enemy that understood human infrastructure well enough to target its most vulnerable points. Miguel and I decided to continue toward the airport with David's family, reasoning that our combined knowledge and skills would give us better chances of survival than traveling separately. David had mechanical skills from his job as an auto mechanic. Sarah had medical knowledge. Their son understood technology systems, and their daughter had been studying logistics and supply chain management. As we moved through the tunnel system, I found myself thinking about Mrs. Patterson and Tommy, hoping that they had survived the infected assault on the vault. I also thought about my grandmother's stories, wondering if the changing sickness she had described was the same thing we were dealing with now. If these outbreaks were cyclical, if they had happened before in human history, then maybe there were lessons from the past that could help us survive and recover. Information that had been preserved in oral traditions, passed down through generations, as stories and warnings. The tunnel system was more extensive than any of us had realized. According to the city planning documents, the abandoned subway construction connected to utility tunnels, storm drains, and maintenance corridors throughout the Phoenix metropolitan area. With proper navigation, it might be possible to reach almost any part of the city without going to the surface. But we were also learning that the infected were adapting faster than we had expected. David's family reported seeing evidence that they were beginning to explore underground spaces, and there were signs of organized excavation in some areas. Whatever intelligence was directing their behavior, it was learning about human infrastructure and developing countermeasures to our survival strategies. As we approached the halfway point to the airport, the tunnel system opened into a larger chamber that had been intended as a subway station. The space was unfinished, with concrete platforms and empty tracks, but it provided room for our group to rest and plan our next moves. It was there that we encountered something that changed our understanding of the crisis completely. In the unfinished subway station, we found something that shattered every assumption we had made about this outbreak. Carved into the concrete walls, in multiple languages including English, Spanish, and what looked like Cherokee symbols, were warnings about the changing sickness. The carvings were old, weathered by years of moisture and neglect, but they were clearly intentional messages left by people who had experienced this before. My hands were shaking as I traced the Cherokee symbols with my fingers. They matched the stories my grandmother had told me, the ones I had dismissed as folklore. The symbols described cycles of sickness, periods of calm, and the signs that preceded each outbreak. According to these carvings, this was not the first time Phoenix had experienced something like this, and it would not be the last. David was examining the English text while his son took photos with his phone, hoping to preserve the information even though cellular networks were down. The English warnings were specific about survival strategies, describing underground sanctuaries, water purification methods, and techniques for identifying people who were resistant to the infection. But what disturbed me most was a section that described how the infected evolved during each outbreak cycle. According to these carvings, the creatures we were dealing with now were just the beginning. Over time, they would develop more sophisticated intelligence, better coordination, and eventually the ability to create their own technology and infrastructure. Sarah was reading the Spanish text, which seemed to focus on medical information. Her nursing background helped her interpret descriptions of infection progression, treatment attempts, and documentation of people who had survived exposure to the changing sickness. "This says that some people have natural immunity," she announced, "and that immunity can sometimes be transferred through blood transfusions or other medical procedures. It also describes a pattern where children and teenagers are more likely to survive the infection than adults." I thought immediately of Tommy, fighting the infection back at the library with Mrs. Patterson. If these carvings were accurate, his age might actually give him better chances of survival than we had realized. Miguel was studying the structural details carved into the walls, which included engineering information about reinforced shelters and defensive positions. Whoever wrote this understood construction and civil engineering. These are not random survival tips. This is systematic knowledge about how to build communities that can withstand long-term siege conditions. The implications were staggering. If these outbreaks were cyclical, if they had happened multiple times throughout history, then human civilization had been dealing with this threat for generations. But each time, most of the knowledge about the crisis was lost when society collapsed, leaving only fragments like these carvings to warn future generations. David's daughter Jessica was the first to point out the most disturbing detail. The carvings included dates, marking when previous outbreaks had occurred. According to the timeline carved into the concrete, major outbreaks happened approximately every 70 to 80 years, with smaller incidents occurring more frequently. The most recent major outbreak, according to these records, had been in the 1940s. That meant we were overdue for another large-scale crisis, which explained why this outbreak was so much more severe and coordinated than anything in recent memory. As we studied the carvings, we began to hear sounds from the tunnel we had just traveled through. Not the random shuffling of individual infected, but the organized movement of a coordinated group. They had found our trail and were following us through the underground system. Miguel immediately began assessing our tactical situation. The unfinished subway station had multiple tunnel entrances, which gave us options for escape, but also meant we could be surrounded if the infected were coordinating their approach. David started gathering our supplies while Sarah checked our medical equipment. Jessica was still documenting the wall carvings, understanding that this information might be crucial for other survivors. But I was focused on a section of the carvings that described emergency protocols for situations exactly like ours. According to the Cherokee symbols, there were designated sanctuary points throughout the underground system, places that had been specifically prepared for long-term survival during outbreak periods. The nearest sanctuary was supposedly located in the old subway construction near the airport, exactly where we had been heading. But the carvings also warned that these sanctuary locations were known to the infected from previous outbreaks, and that they would eventually be found and attacked. The key was using them as temporary bases while preparing for longer-term survival strategies. The sounds from the tunnel were getting closer, and we could hear the distinctive pattern of coordinated movement that indicated the infected were working together to track us. Miguel estimated we had maybe 15 minutes before they reached the station. I made the decision to split our group temporarily. Miguel and I would continue toward the airport sanctuary, carrying the most essential survival information and supplies. David's family would take a different route through the tunnel system, heading toward a secondary sanctuary location mentioned in the carvings. We would attempt to reconnect at the airport if both groups successfully reached their destinations. But if not, each group would have enough knowledge and resources to survive independently. Sarah insisted on leaving us some of her medical supplies, including antibiotics and pain medication that might be crucial if we encountered other survivors who needed treatment. She also gave me detailed instructions for treating infection symptoms, based on both her nursing experience and the medical information carved into the station walls. Jessica had finished documenting the carvings and created hand-drawn copies of the most important survival information. She gave Miguel and me one set of copies and kept another set for her family's use. David contributed mechanical tools and materials that might be useful for creating shelters or defenses in the underground system. His automotive repair background had taught him creative problem-solving with limited resources, knowledge that was proving invaluable in our current situation. As we prepared to separate, I realized how much our group had learned from each other in just a few hours. David's practical skills complemented Sarah's medical knowledge. Jessica's documentation abilities preserved crucial information, and Miguel's construction expertise kept us all safe. But I also understood that survival was going to require difficult choices, and keeping our group together might actually reduce everyone's chances of making it to safety. The infected reached the station just as we were completing our preparations. Through the tunnel entrances, we could see them moving with frightening coordination, dividing into smaller groups to explore different routes through the underground system. What made their behavior particularly disturbing was that they seemed to understand the layout of the tunnel system without having to explore it randomly. They moved like they had maps or previous knowledge of the underground infrastructure. Miguel and I took the eastern tunnel toward the airport, while David's family headed west toward the secondary sanctuary. We agreed to leave coded messages at specific locations if we found safe areas or encountered other survivors. The eastern tunnel was in better condition than the passages we had used to reach the station, with proper lighting systems that were still functional and drainage that kept the walkways relatively dry. According to the city planning documents, this section had been completed before funding was cut, so the construction was more robust. But we also encountered evidence that the infected had been using these tunnels regularly. There were signs of organized camps, areas where they had gathered supplies, and markings on the walls that looked like some kind of communication system. Miguel pointed out that the markings were not random scratches or damage. They were deliberate symbols, placed at regular intervals and clearly intended to convey information to other infected individuals. They have developed their own written communication system, he said grimly. That suggests a level of intelligence and social organization that makes them much more dangerous than mindless monsters. I was thinking about the carvings in the subway station, particularly the warnings about how the infected evolved during outbreak cycles. If they were already developing written communication within days of the initial outbreak, their progression toward more sophisticated intelligence was happening faster than previous cycles. We encountered our first other survivor group about an hour after leaving the station. 3 adults and 2 children who had been hiding in a maintenance alcove, terrified and running low on supplies. They had been in the tunnels for 4 days, trying to reach family members in other parts of the city. The adults were clearly exhausted and struggling to care for the children, who were showing signs of dehydration and malnutrition. Miguel and I shared our water and food supplies, and I provided them with copies of the survival information we had documented from the subway station carvings. But we also learned disturbing information from them about the situation on the surface. According to their observations before entering the tunnel system, the infected were not just taking over human territories randomly. They were specifically targeting and capturing people with technical knowledge, medical training, and other specialized skills. Engineers, doctors, scientists, and skilled tradespeople were being gathered at central collection points rather than being killed or infected. This suggested that whatever intelligence was directing the infected understood the value of human expertise and was attempting to preserve it for their own purposes. The implications were terrifying. If the infected were systematically capturing people with specialized knowledge, then they were building the foundation for their own technological civilization, while simultaneously destroying humanity's ability to resist or recover. I shared this information with Miguel, and we both understood that our survival strategy needed to account for the possibility that we might be specifically targeted because of our knowledge and skills. We left the other survivor group with detailed directions to the sanctuary locations and continued toward the airport. But the tunnel system was becoming more dangerous as we got closer to our destination. We encountered infected patrols moving through the underground passages, clearly searching for survivors with systematic precision. Their behavior was nothing like the mindless wandering we had observed during the first day of the outbreak. These infected individuals moved in coordinated teams, communicated through hand signals and quiet vocalizations, and demonstrated problem-solving abilities that suggested they retained significant cognitive function. Miguel and I had to hide in maintenance alcoves multiple times to avoid detection, and we both understood that we were being hunted by an intelligence that was learning our tactics as quickly as we could develop them. The city planning documents showed that we were approaching the airport sanctuary, but we also encountered evidence that the location had been compromised. Recent markings on the tunnel walls, signs of organized excavation, and the presence of infected patrols all suggested that the sanctuary was no longer safe. We faced a critical decision: continue to the airport sanctuary despite the obvious dangers, or try to find an alternative safe location using the incomplete information we had gathered from various sources. I decided to use my grandfather's military manual to guide our tactical decision-making. The manual emphasized the importance of reconnaissance before committing to any major movement, so we spent several hours observing the area around the sanctuary before making our approach. What we discovered confirmed our worst fears. The airport sanctuary had been found and was under siege by a large organized group of infected. But what made the situation even more disturbing was that the infected were not trying to break into the sanctuary by force. Instead, they were conducting what looked like a negotiation or communication attempt with the survivors inside. We could see infected individuals approaching the sanctuary entrance and engaging in some kind of gesture-based communication with people who were clearly still human. This behavior was completely inconsistent with everything we thought we knew about the infected. If they were trying to communicate rather than simply attack, it suggested a level of intelligence and social organization that made them far more dangerous than any mindless plague. Miguel and I watched this interaction for several hours, trying to understand what was happening. The infected were clearly attempting to convince the survivors to come out voluntarily, using tactics that seemed almost diplomatic rather than predatory. Some of the survivors did emerge from the sanctuary, apparently convinced by whatever communication they had received. But instead of being attacked or infected, they were escorted away by infected guards toward what looked like a larger collection operation. The remaining survivors in the sanctuary seemed to be debating among themselves about whether to surrender or continue resisting. Through our observations, we could see that they were running low on supplies and faced the difficult choice between gradual starvation and voluntary surrender to an unknown fate. I realized that we were witnessing something unprecedented in human history. The infected were not just an overwhelming force of destruction. They were an organized intelligence attempting to incorporate human survivors into some kind of new social structure. The question was whether this incorporation meant enslavement, transformation, or something else entirely, and whether the survivors who surrendered voluntarily would retain their humanity or become something else. Miguel and I spent the rest of the day documenting what we observed and trying to develop alternative survival strategies. The airport sanctuary was clearly not an option for us, and we needed to find other safe locations that had not been compromised. But we also understood that traditional survival strategies were not going to be effective against an enemy that could think, plan, and adapt to our tactics. We needed to develop new approaches to resistance and survival that accounted for the intelligence and organization of the infected. As evening approached, we made the difficult decision to abandon our plans to reach the airport sanctuary. Instead, we would try to find David's family at the secondary sanctuary location and combine our knowledge to develop better long-term survival strategies. The tunnel system between our current location and the secondary sanctuary was largely unexplored territory, according to the city planning documents. We would be traveling through areas that might be structurally unsound, potentially flooded, or already occupied by infected patrols. But staying near the airport sanctuary was clearly not safe, and we had learned enough about infected tactics to know that they would eventually expand their search operations to include the surrounding tunnel areas. As we prepared to leave our observation position, I thought about Mrs. Patterson and Tommy back at the library. If Tommy had survived the infection, if he had somehow fought off the changing sickness, then he might represent hope for developing resistance strategies or even treatments for other survivors. But if he had turned, if Mrs. Patterson had been forced to make the impossible choice she had prepared for, then their sacrifice had bought Miguel and me the time we needed to gather crucial intelligence about the true nature of this crisis. Either way, the knowledge we had gained about infected intelligence and organization was too important to lose. We had to survive long enough to share this information with other survivor groups and help coordinate more effective resistance strategies. The journey to the secondary sanctuary would be our most dangerous undertaking yet, but it was also our best chance of finding other survivors who could help us understand and respond to this evolving threat. The journey to the secondary sanctuary took us through sections of the underground system that had never been completed. Areas where construction had stopped abruptly when funding was cut in the mid-90s. These tunnels were rougher, less stable, and filled with hazards that tested every survival skill Miguel and I had learned over the past 3 days. We encountered our first major obstacle about 2 hours into the journey. A section of tunnel had collapsed, probably during construction, leaving a gap that was too wide to jump and too deep to safely climb down. According to the city planning documents, there should have been an alternate route through a utility corridor, but finding it in the dark was proving more difficult than expected. Miguel's construction experience was invaluable here. He could assess the structural integrity of damaged areas and identify safe paths through unstable terrain. But even with his expertise, we were forced to backtrack twice when passages proved too dangerous to navigate. It was during one of these detours that we encountered evidence of something that changed our understanding of the infected once again. In a side tunnel that had been used for equipment storage during the original construction, we found what appeared to be an infected base camp. But this was not the random gathering place we might have expected. This was an organized operation with clearly defined areas for different activities. There were spaces that looked like workshops where infected individuals were modifying tools and equipment. There were storage areas with supplies that had been systematically collected from the surface. There were even what appeared to be sleeping areas arranged in patterns that suggested social hierarchy. Most disturbing of all, there were human survivors working alongside infected individuals in what appeared to be voluntary cooperation. These humans did not show signs of infection, but they were clearly participating in whatever activities the infected were conducting. Miguel and I watched this operation from a concealed position for over an hour, trying to understand what we were seeing. The humans appeared to be providing technical expertise while the infected handled physical labor and security. It was a division of labor that suggested genuine cooperation rather than coercion. One of the human collaborators was someone I recognized from the library. Dr. Jennifer Martinez had been a regular patron who used our medical databases for research. She was a biochemist who had often discussed her work on infectious disease research. Seeing her working voluntarily with infected individuals was deeply unsettling. But what made the situation even more complex was that Dr. Martinez appeared to be conducting medical research in the base camp. She had set up what looked like a laboratory using equipment that had been salvaged from hospitals or research facilities. She was clearly studying the infection, possibly trying to understand or modify its effects. This raised the possibility that some humans were choosing to work with the infected because they believed cooperation offered better survival chances than resistance. Or perhaps they thought they could influence the direction of infected society from within. Miguel pointed out that the infected individuals in the base camp moved with even more coordination and intelligence than the patrol groups we had encountered earlier. They used tools effectively, communicated through a complex system of gestures and sounds, and demonstrated problem-solving abilities that were clearly beyond basic survival instincts. We documented what we observed and continued toward the secondary sanctuary, but the implications of the base camp were troubling. If the infected were successfully recruiting human collaborators and establishing permanent settlements, then they were building the foundation for a new type of civilization. The question was whether this emerging civilization would eventually replace human society entirely, or whether some form of coexistence might be possible, and whether the humans who chose cooperation would remain human or gradually become something else. We reached the secondary sanctuary location around midnight, exhausted and running low on supplies. According to the carvings from the subway station, this sanctuary should have been located in a natural cavern system that had been incorporated into the underground construction project. What we found exceeded our expectations. The sanctuary was not just a hiding place, but a genuine underground community that had been prepared for exactly this type of crisis. Multiple chambers connected by natural passages, underground water sources, ventilation systems that connected to the surface through concealed openings, and storage areas stocked with supplies that had been accumulated over years. David's family was there, along with more than 30 other survivors who had found their way to the sanctuary through various routes. But what made this community remarkable was not just its size, but the fact that it was clearly organized according to principles that had been developed during previous outbreak cycles. The sanctuary had a governing council made up of people with different areas of expertise: medical knowledge, engineering skills, agricultural experience, military training, and what they called cultural preservation, which involved maintaining knowledge of previous outbreaks and survival strategies. An elderly Cherokee woman named Margaret was serving as the cultural preservation leader, and when she heard my name and learned about my grandmother's stories, she immediately understood the connection. "Your grandmother was Elena Hartwell," she said with certainty. "She was one of the knowledge keepers from the last major outbreak in the 1940s. The stories she told you were not folklore. They were survival instructions that have been passed down through our families for generations." Margaret explained that Cherokee oral traditions had preserved detailed information about the changing sickness cycles, including strategies that had proven effective for long-term survival and community building. This knowledge had been carefully maintained and updated after each outbreak, creating a comprehensive survival guide that most of the world had never known existed. According to Margaret, the current outbreak was following patterns that were consistent with historical cycles, but with some disturbing variations. The infected were evolving faster than in previous outbreaks, developing more sophisticated intelligence and organizational capabilities within days rather than months. This acceleration suggested that either the infection itself had mutated, or that modern infrastructure and technology were somehow enhancing the development of infected intelligence. Either way, traditional survival strategies needed to be updated to account for the increased threat level. The sanctuary's medical team, led by a retired infectious disease specialist named Dr. Roberts, had been studying infection samples and survivor testimonies to understand the current outbreak's characteristics. Their findings were both encouraging and terrifying. The encouraging news was that natural immunity to the infection was more common than previously understood, affecting approximately 15 to 20% of the population. Children and teenagers had even higher resistance rates, which explained why Tommy might have survived his exposure at the library. The terrifying news was that the infection appeared to be designed rather than natural. Dr. Roberts had identified viral components that suggested genetic engineering, along with delivery mechanisms that were too sophisticated for natural evolution. "This is not a natural plague," he explained to Miguel and me. "This is a biological weapon that has been specifically designed to target human social and technological infrastructure. The fact that it preserves certain cognitive functions while eliminating others suggests that it was created to produce controllable rather than destructive results." The implications were staggering. If the infection was artificial, then someone had deliberately triggered this outbreak. And if the goal was control rather than destruction, then the infected might represent the early stages of a planned replacement for human civilization. Margaret added historical context that made the situation even more disturbing. According to Cherokee oral traditions, previous outbreaks had always followed periods of rapid technological advancement. The pattern suggested that the changing sickness was triggered when human societies reached certain developmental thresholds. Our ancestors believed that the sickness was a natural response to prevent humans from developing technologies that could threaten the balance of life on Earth, she explained. But if this outbreak is artificial, then someone has turned a natural protection mechanism into a weapon. The sanctuary's engineering team had been monitoring communications from other survivor communities, and the news from around the country was mixed. Some cities had been completely overrun, with no organized human resistance remaining. Others had managed to establish defensible zones where human survivors were holding out against infected forces. But the most disturbing reports came from areas where infected communities were expanding rapidly, apparently through voluntary recruitment of human survivors. These hybrid communities were developing new technologies and social structures that combined human knowledge with infected organizational capabilities. Dr. Roberts believed that these hybrid communities represented the long-term goal of whoever had engineered the outbreak. Not the destruction of humanity, but its transformation into something that could be more easily controlled or directed. Miguel and I shared our observations from the airport sanctuary and the infected base camp, which provided additional evidence for Dr. Roberts' theory. The fact that infected individuals were specifically targeting people with technical knowledge suggested a systematic plan to preserve and redirect human expertise. The sanctuary's governing council spent hours discussing response strategies, but the options were limited. They could continue hiding underground and hope to outlast the outbreak. They could attempt to establish contact with military forces that might still be organized, or they could try to develop countermeasures against the infection itself. Margaret advocated for a fourth option based on Cherokee survival traditions. Instead of trying to fight or hide from the outbreak, They could attempt to understand and work with whatever natural forces might be involved in the cycle. Our ancestors survived previous outbreaks not by fighting the changing sickness, but by learning to live in harmony with it, she explained. They developed communities that could coexist with infected individuals without being destroyed or fully transformed. Dr. Roberts was skeptical about the coexistence approach, arguing that an artificially engineered outbreak might not follow the same patterns as natural cycles. But he agreed that understanding the infection's true purpose might be key to developing effective resistance strategies. The council decided to split their efforts across multiple approaches. Some members would continue developing the sanctuary as a long-term survival base. Others would attempt to establish contact with military or government forces that might still be operational. A third group would focus on medical research aimed at developing treatments or countermeasures. Margaret requested that Miguel and I join a special team that would attempt to gather more information about the outbreak's origins and purpose. Our observations of infected behavior and organization made us valuable for intelligence gathering operations. But before we could begin any new missions, we needed to rest and resupply. The sanctuary had sleeping areas, clean water, preserved food, and medical supplies that allowed us to recover from our journey through the tunnels. It was during this rest period that we received news that changed everything once again. A radio message from a survivor group in Colorado reported that they had made contact with Tommy Vasquez, teenager from my library who had been fighting the infection. Tommy had not only survived, he had somehow developed abilities that allowed him to communicate with infected individuals without being attacked. He was serving as a translator and negotiator between human survivor communities and infected groups, helping to establish non-aggression agreements in several areas. The message indicated that Tommy was requesting contact with me specifically, believing that my knowledge of survival resources and community organization could help develop broader cooperation agreements between humans and infected. This news forced me to confront possibilities I had not considered before. If Tommy had survived and developed special abilities, then perhaps the infection was not simply about destruction or control. Perhaps it was about evolution, about pushing human society towards something entirely new. Margaret was not surprised by this development. According to Cherokee traditions, some individuals always emerged from outbreak cycles with enhanced abilities that allowed them to bridge the gap between human and infected communities. These bridge people are crucial for the survival of both groups, she explained. They prevent total war and help establish the balance that allows civilization to eventually rebuild. But the decision about whether to attempt contact with Tommy would have to wait. The sanctuary's security teams had detected increased infected activity in the surrounding tunnel areas, suggesting that our location might have been discovered. The next phase of our survival would require all the knowledge and cooperation we could manage, but it would also test whether the choices we made in the coming hours would determine the future of human civilization itself. The security teams were right about increased infected activity. By dawn of our third day in the sanctuary, we could hear organized movement in the tunnels above us, and the pattern was disturbingly familiar. The infected were conducting the same systematic search operation we had witnessed at the airport sanctuary, which meant they had developed intelligence about underground survivor communities and were working to locate them all. Margaret called an emergency council meeting to discuss our options. The sanctuary had been designed for long-term siege conditions, with multiple escape routes and sufficient supplies to last several months. But the Cherokee oral traditions also warned against becoming trapped in underground refuges during outbreak cycles. Our ancestors learned that staying hidden only works for short periods, Margaret explained to the assembled survivors. Eventually, the infected develop enough intelligence to find any fixed location. Long-term survival requires mobility and adaptation, not fortification. Dr. Roberts disagreed, arguing that the sanctuary represented our best chance of surviving until military or government forces could regain control. But his position was based on the assumption that this outbreak would follow the same pattern as natural disasters or conventional warfare. Miguel supported Margaret's position based on his observations of infected tactical capabilities. They learn faster than we can adapt our defenses. If we stay here, they will eventually find a way in, and then we will be trapped with no escape options. The debate was interrupted by a radio transmission that changed our entire strategic situation. The message was from Tommy Vasquez, and it was being broadcast on multiple frequencies to reach survivor communities throughout the region. This is Tommy Vasquez calling for Donovan Hartwell from the Maryvale Library. Mr. Hartwell, if you can hear this, I need to speak with you about something that affects all survivor communities. I have learned things about the infection you need to know. The infected are not what we thought they were, and the situation is more complex than anyone realizes. The transmission continued with specific information that only Tommy could have known, confirming that he was indeed alive and apparently free to communicate. But what made the message particularly significant was that it was being transmitted from Phoenix Sky Harbor Airport, the same location where we had observed the siege of the original sanctuary. Tommy was requesting a meeting at a neutral location, a shopping mall in central Phoenix that he claimed had been established as a communication zone between human and infected communities. He promised safe passage for any survivors willing to participate in negotiations about long-term coexistence arrangements. The Sanctuary Council spent hours debating whether to respond to Tommy's message. Some members argued that it was obviously a trap, that Tommy had either been infected or was being coerced into luring survivors into the open. Others believed that if Tommy had truly developed bridge abilities, communication with him might be our only hope for long-term survival. Margaret supported attempting contact based on Cherokee traditions about bridge people during previous outbreak cycles. These individuals are rare and precious. They prevent total war between human and infected communities. If Tommy has truly become a bridge person, ignoring his message could doom both groups to endless conflict. Dr. Roberts remained skeptical but agreed that Tommy's survival and apparent freedom represented data that contradicted his theories about the infection. If Tommy had developed immunity or special abilities, studying his condition might lead to treatments for other survivors. I felt personally responsible for making the decision, since Tommy was requesting contact with me specifically. He was just a 15-year-old kid who had trusted me enough to come to the library for safety when his world fell apart. If there was any chance he was genuinely trying to help, I owed it to him to respond. But I also understood that my decision could affect the survival of everyone in the sanctuary. If this was a trap, if Tommy had been compromised or was being manipulated, then attempting contact could lead infected forces directly to our location. After extensive discussion, the council agreed to a limited response. Miguel and I would attempt to reach the communication zone, while the sanctuary prepared for potential evacuation if our mission was compromised. David's family volunteered to serve as backup communication, maintaining radio contact and coordinating emergency procedures if needed. The journey to the shopping mall required us to travel through areas of Phoenix that had been completely transformed by 3 days of infected occupation. Using the tunnel system and occasional surface reconnaissance, we could see that the infected had established permanent settlements in strategic locations throughout the city. But these settlements were not the chaotic destruction zones we had expected. They were organized communities with clear infrastructure, division of labor, and social hierarchy. The infected had maintained and improved human facilities rather than destroying them, suggesting long-term planning and sophisticated intelligence. We also observed human survivors working within these infected communities, apparently by choice rather than coercion. Some were performing technical tasks like equipment maintenance and communication operations. Others seemed to be involved in planning and administrative functions. This voluntary cooperation between humans and infected was more extensive than anything we had witnessed before, and it supported Margaret's theories about coexistence during outbreak cycles. The shopping mall that Tommy had designated as a meeting location was in an area that showed clear signs of being a neutral zone. There were both human and infected individuals present, but they were not interacting in the predatory relationships we had observed elsewhere. Instead, they seemed to be conducting some form of trade or communication, with infected individuals providing physical labor and security while humans contributed technical knowledge and problem-solving abilities. It was a functional relationship that challenged everything we thought we knew about the infection. Tommy was waiting for us in the central court of the mall, and seeing him was both a relief and a shock. He was clearly still human, still recognizably the teenager I had known at the library. But there were subtle changes that indicated his exposure to the infection had affected him in ways that were not immediately obvious. His eyes had a quality of awareness that seemed enhanced, as if he could perceive things that normal humans could not. His movements were more coordinated and efficient than before. And when infected individuals approached our meeting area, they showed him a level of respect that suggested special status within their social hierarchy. "Mr. Hartwell, thank you for coming. I know this must seem impossible, but I need you to understand what I have learned about the infection and what it means for everyone's survival." Tommy explained that his experience with the infection had been different from what Mrs. Patterson and I had observed. Instead of being completely transformed or dying from the exposure, he had developed what he called dual awareness, the ability to understand both human and infected perspectives simultaneously. "The infection does not destroy intelligence or personality," he said. "It adds new layers of perception and communication that most humans cannot integrate with their existing consciousness. Most people either reject the new awareness completely, which kills them, or accept it completely, which transforms them into infected." But Tommy had somehow managed to maintain both forms of awareness, allowing him to serve as a translator between the two communities. This bridge ability was apparently rare but not unique, and it represented the key to long-term survival for both groups. According to Tommy, the infected were not mindless monsters or controlled slaves. They were humans who had accepted a different form of consciousness that emphasized collective thinking and coordinated action over individual decision-making. They retained their memories, knowledge, and basic personalities, but their priorities and social behaviors had been fundamentally altered. "They do not want to destroy human civilization," Tommy explained. "They want to transform it into something that can survive the long-term challenges that normal humans cannot handle. Climate change, resource depletion, social conflict, all the problems that were leading towards civilizational collapse before the outbreak. The infection was apparently a response to these systemic threats, a biological mechanism that forced human society to reorganize itself around collective survival rather than individual competition. But the transformation process was traumatic and often fatal, which explained the initial chaos and violence of the outbreak. Tommy's role as a bridge person was to help establish communication protocols that would allow the transformation to occur more gradually and voluntarily, reducing the trauma and casualties associated with the process. But this explanation raised disturbing questions about the nature of human free will and the right of any group to force evolutionary changes on the entire species. Even if the infected believed they were saving humanity from self-destruction, did they have the right to transform human civilization without consent? Miguel voiced these concerns directly. What about people who do not want to be transformed? What about communities that want to remain fully human? Are we being given a choice, or is this being forced on everyone? Tommy's response was both. honest and troubling. The choice exists, but it comes with consequences. Human communities that remain completely isolated from infected groups will eventually face the same systemic problems that were driving civilization toward collapse before. The outbreak. Resource conflicts, environmental degradation, social breakdown. He explained that infected communities had developed solutions to these problems through their collective consciousness and coordinated behavior. They could manage resources more efficiently, respond to environmental challenges more effectively, and maintain social stability without the conflicts that plagued normal human societies. But these advantages came at the cost of individual autonomy and traditional human social structures. The question was whether humanity would voluntarily accept these trade-offs, or be forced to accept them through continued conflict and gradual attrition. Tommy was proposing a middle path, where human and infected communities could coexist and cooperate without forced transformation. Bridge people like himself would facilitate communication and coordination, allowing both groups to benefit from each other's strengths while maintaining their distinct characteristics. This coexistence model had apparently been tested in several locations around the country, with varying degrees of success. Some communities had established stable relationships that allowed for trade, shared resources, and mutual defense. Others had devolved into ongoing conflict, despite bridge person mediation. The key factors for successful coexistence seemed to be mutual respect for different consciousness types, clear agreements about territory and resources, and ongoing communication through bridge people who could prevent misunderstandings from escalating into conflict. Tommy was requesting that our sanctuary community consider participating in a coexistence pilot program, where we would establish formal communication with local infected groups and work toward mutually beneficial arrangements. But he also warned us that choosing isolation was becoming increasingly difficult. Infected communities were expanding rapidly, and they viewed completely isolated human groups as potential threats that needed to be either integrated or neutralized. The window for voluntary cooperation is closing, Tommy explained. As infected communities become larger and more organized, they are developing the capability to force transformation on resistant groups. If human communities want to maintain any degree of autonomy, they need to establish cooperative relationships before that capability is fully developed. This timeline pressure forced us to confront the reality that our sanctuary's long-term survival strategy might not be viable. If we could not remain hidden indefinitely, and if military rescue was unlikely, then negotiation might be our only realistic option. But negotiation required trust, and trust required understanding the true intentions and capabilities of the groups we would be dealing with. Tommy's bridge perspective provided valuable intelligence, but it was still just one person's interpretation of a complex and rapidly evolving situation. Miguel and I spent several hours at the mall, observing the interactions between human and infected individuals and trying to assess the viability of the coexistence model. What we saw was encouraging in some ways and disturbing in others. The cooperation was genuine, with both groups contributing their strengths to shared projects and problem-solving efforts. But the infected individuals clearly held dominant positions in the relationship, and the humans seemed to be gradually adopting infected behavioral patterns and communication styles. This suggested that coexistence might be a transitional phase, rather than a stable end state, with human participants eventually becoming fully integrated into infected communities through gradual transformation rather than sudden conversion. When we returned to the sanctuary, we faced the difficult task of presenting Tommy's proposal to the council and helping them make a decision that could determine the future of our community. Margaret was supportive of attempting coexistence, based on Cherokee traditions that emphasized adaptation and balance rather than resistance and conflict. Dr. Roberts remained skeptical but acknowledged that Tommy's survival and abilities represented phenomena that contradicted his medical understanding. of the infection. David's family was divided, with the parents concerned about protecting their children and the teenagers more interested in exploring the possibilities that Tommy's bridge abilities represented. The final decision would require consensus from the entire sanctuary community, and that process revealed deep philosophical divisions about the nature of humanity, the value of individual autonomy, and the acceptable costs of survival. But while we debated these questions, the infected communities were continuing to expand and develop their capabilities. The choice between coexistence and resistance was being made for us by the simple passage of time and the evolution of circumstances beyond our control. What I learned during those 72 hours in Phoenix was that survival sometimes requires accepting changes that fundamentally alter who you are and what your society becomes. The question was not whether change would occur, but whether we would have any influence over the direction and pace of that change. Tommy had offered us that influence, but accepting it meant acknowledging that the world we had known was gone forever, and that our survival depended on our ability to adapt to realities that challenged our most basic assumptions about human nature and civilization. The 72 hours were ending, but the larger story of what humanity would become was just beginning.